Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. It means a lot to get so many people out to hear Peter speak. So my name is Lawrence, and I'm with the Toronto Tool Library and the Institute for Resource-Based Economy, which is the Canadian nonprofit that runs the Tool Library. And IRBE, as we like to call it, it was born in around 2011 in a very special house. This house was called Z House. And Z House was there as a result of a bunch of people who watched a documentary back in 2008, 2009, and were inspired by an idea. They met up at these different chapter places around Toronto and decided, hey, we want to join this movement, this zeitgeist movement. But we wanted a place where we could do frequent meetings, we could host people, and we could start to sort of together create and envision what this sort of new vision would look like. So we got a house together, and that house, we had 5 bedrooms, and at its height, there was 13 people living there. It was really chaos. 2 bathrooms, which is not enough for that many people. But it was a very special time, and I got to meet there myself, like lots of people that are lifetime friends to me now, and really like the Tool Library is a direct result of us seeing the zeitgeist movies. And it's been a wonderful journey, and we're so happy to have Peter here. Of course, no introduction necessary. He's an activist, an author, and a filmmaker. And thank you very much, Peter, for being here. I won't take too much time, and hand it over to Peter now.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate seeing so many faces. This is amazing. I came here, well, my intent to come to Toronto in general was to go to the North American Basic Income Guarantee Conference that happened over in Hamilton. And I was fortunate to be invited there and to speak with so many great people that are continuing the exact same train of thought. And it's great to see this bridging starting to occur over the past 10 years. Who here is familiar with the basic tenets of the movement and our train of thought? All right, well, I'm gonna leave. Well, actually, I'm glad to hear that, because what I'm going to do today is very different from the droning hour-long lectures I've done in the past that try to encapsulate everything. You know, I've done about 20 of these things over the past 10 years, and I want to do something different. This particular presentation was done for Z-Day 2018 in Berlin, Germany. Excuse me, Frankfurt, Germany. And unfortunately, the audio was recorded kind of poorly, so I was like, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to be able to do the presentation again and get it done in a good performance quality. So it's kind of inadvertent, but I think you'll enjoy it. But it's a little bit different from the general movement stuff. So lots of time for questions at the end. Anything that seems foreign in this presentation, make a note. And I'm very exhausted, so if you want to ask me really complicated questions, you can make me look like an idiot probably pretty well. But here we go. The relations by which terms are related are an integral part of the terms they relate. It's a really spooky sentence, and it has to do with what is in between the things that we recognize. And it fundamentally is based around something called systems theory. I wrote a book a number of years back. I've written 2 books, but one book, the main one for the movement, at the very end there's a big detailed outline of economic calculation, put in symbolic logic language to be consistent with more economic theory. And it's kind of a crude outline of what the formation of the new economy would be. What I wanted to do here is look at the internals of this based on something called cybernetics. It's the fundamental referent theory, if you will. In my opinion, there's subjective elements to it. But when I learned about this years ago, and I finally learned more about it, has so much wonderful information that needs to be applied to any kind of systems thinking, but specifically systems of economy. Merged large-scale systems of economy that actually work as one system, not what we have today. And what I want to do is give some history about all of this, and then talk about the inferential elements of it. Then I'm going to have kind of an example of what happened in history with a man named Stafford Beer and the Chilean government in the 1970s. So anyway, in 1948, a mathematician named Norbert Wiener, working at MIT, wrote a very impactful book that none of us have ever heard of, called Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, with the general definition of cybernetics as the science of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things. Don't worry, it gets easier as I go along. Stafford Beer, who will be talked about later, as I mentioned, is probably one of the most famous proponents of cybernetics. And he reduces it slightly to the science of effective organization. A little bit easier. Yet definitions morph based on who you're talking to. Anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson, who's actually the daughter of Margaret Mead, who is also a prominent cybernetician, takes a different angle in her writings, and she says, cybernetics is not an academic discipline that belongs in a department. It is an attempt to correct an erroneous way of looking at the world and at knowledge in general. In fact, I find it really interesting to hear different people, how they've defined this science over the past 70 years, because different areas of research actually generate different definitions based on context. It's fluid, and it reveals just how encompassing this field actually is due to its interdisciplinary nature. From 1946 to 1953, there were 10 cybernetic conferences, mostly taking place in New York City. The stated aim was to promote meaningful communication across scientific disciplines and restore unity to science. That's a profound kind of idea when you think about all the fragmentation we have in academia, sociology, physics, biology. They said, all of this goes together. If we're going to understand nature, we have to put it all together. They all came from diverse scientific backgrounds to, among other things, better understand how their fields fit together as a single discipline, as I said. And to give a sense of how advanced this thinking was, the very first conference focused on cognitive science as a middle ground, if you will, including such themes as self-regulating and teleological mechanisms, simulated neural networks emulating the calculus of propositional logic, anthropology and how computers might learn how to learn, and other extremely intense ideas of merging different disciplines and thinking about how they evolve together. This is just amazing for 1946, again, because it's the year that the very first computer was created, the ENIAC, that giant computer. And these people immediately knew what the computer symbolized as a cybernetic organism, as it were. Anthropology as related to how computers might learn how to learn. That's really forward thinking for this period of time. Now, within this group, few people stood out prominently, such as Stafford Beer, who today has become almost synonymous with cybernetics, along with his viable system model, which we're going to talk about more so in a second. But let's begin by quickly considering the contrast between reductionist thinking and systems thinking. Stafford Beer brings up a notable reference for reductionist thinking by invoking Aristotle's famous principle of non-contradiction, which simply says something can't be something and not be that something at the same time. So if the proposition A is B, if that's true, then the proposition A is not B can't be true in the same context, obviously. And this manner of logical thinking is the basis of our deductive reasoning. We use it all the time innately. And it has naturally led to good solutions overall in terms of pocket development, understanding academic disciplines, and so on. But the problem with this level of thinking, which I actually believe is kind of inherent to the human mind, if you will, it's like a cognitive bias that we have to fight against, is it implies that nothing really overlaps, that everything is just divided and kind of linearly hierarchical, if you will. So the universe just becomes a series of parts, a collection of objects, when the universe is really a collection of systems. System within systems within systems, and the dynamics are very, very different than what is implied by our traditional oversimplified cause and effect deductive reasoning. Hence, it's no wonder, again, as we've divided the intellectual world into parts, like everything else, biology, chemistry, physics, and so on. Stafford Beer has a great joke. Does God see separation between biology and physics? He probably wasn't religious, but the point is, in a holistic sense, these things are what we've created to divide the world up. They're artificial constructs. Nature doesn't see it that way. These are what I call categorical assumptions. And categorical assumptions is what the mind basically does, once again, innately, to try and make sense out of reality, breaking it up. And this general epistemological doctrine and mentality has dominated the way we see the world, the way we see each other. In the same way, in fact, if you look back at old religious beliefs in political economy or just general philosophy, how that dominated, the Middle Ages and very long periods of time. And then we worked to develop science in a reductive approach, and now we have to develop a new integrated science. So anyway, systems science, in contrast to reductionism, highlights how things are related. Instead of seeing this noun and noun, let's start to see nouns as verbs, poetically speaking, to invoke David Bowen. And one characteristic is emergence. Nature, again, is not a series of objects. It's a giant vortex of systems, and those systems interact to produce outcomes that are not present in the sum of their parts. They produce outcomes that are not present, they're not indicative by the sum of their parts. It creates new levels of output, and it's extremely important, and it's a stark contrast to reductionism. Likewise, this emergence always moves from a state of simplicity to complexity, riding the wave of the second law of thermodynamics, if you will, entropy. And this process has brought systemic changes that are no doubt incredible, and the most notable, of course, is the birth of the universe and the rise of life itself. If you think about it in terms of a move from relative simplicity to relative complexity, it's quite stunning. So the Big Bang happens, right? However it happened, we know something happened. We know helium and hydrogen danced around with gravity and electromagnetism. Stars consolidated. They eventually died and exploded. They produced the chemical elements of our periodic table, more things to work with. These new elements formed dust and rocks, eventually planets. And eventually a planet called Earth finds itself right in the perfect Goldilocks condition between the sun, and eventually DNA molecules emerged. They broke and formed, and giving rise to single-cell organisms, multi-cell organisms, and after a good while, our mammalian descendants started to give way to brains, and then humans to really interesting brains, the extension of the prefrontal cortex, to our nervous system itself, which is the most complicated thing in the entire universe. We are embracing the most complicated structure ever put forward. And it doesn't stop there. So this capacity for human intelligence and consciousness leads to language, sharing knowledge, the group mind. And we start to understand ourselves more rapidly, exponentially, because it's literally a collective consciousness building upon generational time, more information, lateral sharing, building thinking machines now, AI, we're building things in our image now, we're increasing the entropic complexity that's being output, so on and so forth. We can only imagine really what's next, frankly, in terms of this large-scale process that is one giant systemic process. So, all this incredible complexity from basically a few raw materials popped out of the womb of the ether some 14 billion years ago, within all of this systemic emergence, we find shared properties. There are rules to this unfolding organization, as you would imagine, repeating structures that we can recognize and hopefully learn from. And system scientists who have taken on the analysis of this incredible complexity have isolated some basic principles or laws that seem to be shared universally. Laws of how life naturally organizes itself, reproduces itself, morphs, and it's seeking to apply that knowledge to other areas of study, notably social organization. The question is, ultimately, how can we use nature to better understand and create complex systems that have the same integrity and adaptability of nature's native systems, say like an economy? Or put in terms of cybernetics, how do we create what's called viable systems once again? Stafford Beer, looking for an answer, considered the human nervous system as the ultimate referent to try and emulate what's actually happened in terms of control and adaptation. Our system maintains homeostasis or balance automatically when it's faced with problems. It controls your blood pressure. It controls your temperature if you're hot like I am right now because of your terrible humidity. And what Beer found, building upon the work of many, is that there are a number of characteristics that are present in every kind of living system and every kind of man-made system that actually works. And the presence and proper calibration of these features determine whether or not it's going to be viable or effective. So if we're going to make man-made systems, we have to have a proper referent to do it right to make it actually functional in the long run and have less negative artifacts or externalities and so on. So first, and most broadly, a viable system actually has a high degree of autonomy. It's not fully autonomous, of course, as nothing is in nature, but it contains internal mechanisms that regulate its own behavior, like the human body. And the more autonomy it achieves, while still existing in balance with its environment, the more viable it is. So the second issue, viable systems are what's called recursive. In other words, every viable system contains other viable systems and is contained by other viable systems. So they're inside of each other, like the dolls that you see, with the dolls inside the dolls inside the dolls. Recursion is about self-reference. Living systems show recursion as the system undergoes this emergence or evolution. Man-made systems show recursion through how they are designed, as I'm going to touch upon. In nature, fractal geometry and self-similarity is a good example, where you see a tree, and the tree grows in a pattern which kind of looks like it's creating other small trees or branches, while the leaves, of course, have veins, if you will, that also share the branching pattern. Or this type of thing here, where it's a very large-scale view of land, and then you compare that type of structure, you see the recursive self-similarity. You can't identify scale when looking at, say, a coastline from above. You don't really know how far you are. Or a spiral galaxy vortex of the Milky Way seems to be quite similar to things like tornadoes or just water going down your sink. This recursiveness is everywhere. And what it means is nature is just repeating certain processes over and over and over again. By the way, I have this book to recommend, since I know most people have never heard of this word recursive or recursion, and it's actually a very complicated thing to define, believe it or not. But I do recommend this book. Third, a viable system's autonomy is supported by self-regulation through positive and negative feedback loops. If you're not familiar with that kind of terminology, it's actually pretty simple. But this is what helps create the inevitable homeostasis of that given system. Again, like the human body regulates your temperature. A positive feedback loop, also known as a self-reinforcing loop, amplifies a given process. It's doing the same thing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, something moving out of control. While negative feedback works to self-balance going back into the system, constantly working to correct any of the excess or problems that emerge. And it happens automatically by automating, so to speak, the adaptation of the system to its homeostatic state. A great historical example of this in machinery, a notable one of the first, it's very commonplace now, we do this stuff all the time in engineering, but this is one of the first, is the Watt governor. It's a simple device that would reduce the speed of a machine automatically based upon gravity. If the machine begins to move too fast, for stability, it corrects. Here's Mr. Beer, who's giving a presentation about these kinds of ideas, explaining the Watt governor. Notable how systems, true systems, don't need to be regulated. They regulate themselves, which, think about that in terms of our social system and economy.
The important thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. Now, you saw me operate this governor just now and noticed how the engine slowed down. Let's see how the mechanism works. Suppose the engine is racing, then the governor flies open like that. You see it lifting here, transmitting the message along here, lifting that cam up here, and then shutting off a valve there. That is built into the system. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
In control systems is what he said. Now, that might seem like a kind of an abstract thing to show, simple machine, mechanism that gets pushed to a certain point and it corrects the machine by nature. It's in balance with itself. But this is precisely the kind of thinking that needs to be applied to social change in terms of how we organize society. Do we need tons of increased security, police and military and law out there? If we have all of that, clearly something's wrong with the system is what is implied here. And there's a lot of thought that can be put into that very notion. It's very, very important. And fourth, building upon the prior system of feedback, is the system must conform to what's called, in conjunction with the author, Ashby's law, which is the law of requisite variety, which says only variety absorbs variety. Put another way, the variety of the regulator has to match or exceed the variety of the system. Variety means complexity. For example, when a country's central bank, Canadian system is pretty much the same as the US system. What do when they're regulating the monetary system? They're pulling these little levers, raising and lowering interest rates, along with a very small number of regulatory features that don't really help anything at all. The complexity of our economic system is vast, as you know. So how could you expect there to be balance within the system with these tiny little mechanisms that really navigate and control only small aspects of the complexity? So you have to match the complexity if you want a system to work. Otherwise, you get what we get over and over again, especially the US monetary policy, is crash after crash after crash after crash. You know, we see this historically, the constant economic bubbles, depressions, and so on, credit crunches. It's because they don't know what they're doing. Those policies do not come close to understanding the vast amount of complexity or variety being generated by the financial behavior itself. So what does regulate it? What is the negative regulatory feedback that would correct human economic imbalances? All this suffering and home foreclosures, that's actually the corrective mechanism. That's the negative feedback that we have in society, is the need to bail things out, is literally losing your home, is literally the crash of Main Street and Wall Street. Criminal prosecution, increased government legislation, draconian laws put forward. This is unfortunately what we do now in the world to correct the shitty system that we have. So Ashby's law is about the proper response and adaptation. A viable system's viability is measured by how well it does this. Since this idea is so important, I want to give another contextual example as related to the Zeitgeist movement. Let's consider the rise of market economics itself. Let's consider the rise of market economics. Oh my God. I'm fired. I can't talk anymore. Let's consider the rise of market economics itself as a single system after the Neolithic Revolution. While crude, the system appeared viable for some time. Its core functions of labor specialization, trade, resource exploitation, the idea of working capital, this stuff worked with instability, but nothing like what we see today. Regulation was minimalistic, since farming and handicraft good production and trade were very slow, simple processes. Very limited amounts of damage could be done. However, like the discovery of oil, which was extremely impactful, of course, for the time, incredible what we did with the discovery of oil, but like the market system, it faces future adaptability problems. Burning fossil fuels is now destroying the atmosphere and polluting the environment to the extent that we simply can't keep up with it. We can't keep up fixing it with the negative feedback loops at the same rate. So the only management solution is to simply stop using this stuff, since the environment certainly isn't going to change its mind. So that same thing applies to the market system, which, since the Industrial Revolution, is now faced with a new environmental condition with adaptability requirements that stand in stark contradiction to the market's inherent behavior. Capitalism today simply can't adjust itself properly unless the system evolves into something that basically isn't capitalism by any form. In other words, you can't have an economy based upon economic growth, cyclical consumption to power jobs, buying more is better in the value system, when a declining ecosystem clearly demands that we actually reduce consumption, we reduce growth. These are really important things that have to change in the leadership and business elite. They're looking the other way because this is what their system is. So, and of course, the chain reaction of any changes are going to be political chain reactions. So you see there's just dead quiet in terms of recognizing these things. And that's why most of these problems are called market externalities, if you're familiar with that term. They're not registered. And as an aside, there's a study that was done of the top industrial producers in America, and it tracked their market externalities and the cost of all the things that go wrong. Pollution, environmental destruction is the most important part. And there's some other things that relate to human health that were also tracked. And they found that literally the entire economy isn't profitable. If you take into account the damage done to the planet and humans, and what it costs to fix all of that, no company on the planet is basically profitable. So it's out of date, no longer compatible with the planet. It can't adapt. It can't adapt. It doesn't have the proper requisite variety once again. Hence, capitalism isn't viable as a system. And by the way, I strongly encourage that if you find yourself, with this hideous cliche debate between someone yelling at you that you're just a socialist or a Marxist, and they create this duality as if that's all there can be in this boxed categorical thinking once again, I suggest you throw this perspective at them. It's not about isms anymore. It's about what works and what doesn't work. It's about what's viable. And this is the conversation that needs to be put forward from the ground up. It's technical. It's very hard intuitively to grasp this in the way that's required. But I want to put this together, just for the sake of it, because I think it's good seeds to plant in terms of the Stafford Beer version model of the viable system. Putting it all together, every viable system, whether it's a cell, the human body, a car production plant, has an environment, an operation, and management. For example, a person's brain is the management, the body is the operation, the habitat is the environment. In terms of variety or complexity, it will generally be the case the environment will have the largest amount of variety, and that makes perfect sense. So that means communication channels between these three elements of the system will need to dynamically adjust to how feedback is received and transmitted as per Ashby's law once again. What I mean by this is information flow can be enormous for any complex system, and there needs to be a way to filter out information. That's part of the process. You have to reduce the variety in a strategic way. The human brain, the manager of the human body, does this by prioritizing needs of the operation, the human body. Likewise, the information of the environment is generally even more complex once again, so the same kind of thing is applied where your habitual perception starts to change as well. So we're filtering out things that aren't relevant to us best we know, and that's what keeps sanity in a given system of vast complexity. Hence, this circuit of communication, showing Ashby's law of requisite variety via this feedback schematic. And again, since this is tedious, if you want to learn about more, I strongly suggest looking up Rosh Ashby's work. And one thing he did to symbolize all of this early on in the mid-20th century, he invented the homeostat machine. And it applies all these principles to keep the machine in absolute balance amongst complicated conditions. Time magazine at the time in 1949 actually described it as the closest thing to the synthetic brain so far designed by man. That noted, you may remember that rule that viable systems exist in other viable systems and have viable systems within. Hence the principle of recursion. Once again, remember a cell, an organ, the body, the habitat, these are recursive in how they operate. This diagram shows one system with 3 subsystems or levels of recursion. It also shows 5 processes of the total system that further regulate the collective system through feedback. And I'm not going to go through all of this. It's too tedious. So I want to talk about this project that Stafford Beer put forward in 1971 when he was hired by the newly elected, democratically elected, president of Chile, Salvador Allende, to build a cybernetic system to assist his new economy, called Project CyberSyn. Basically, when he took power, actually I take that back. Isn't that terrible how our turns of phrase imply things? He didn't take power. He was actually democratically elected. But if you were to read Western literature on it, because he was eventually overthrown by the CIA and other factors, dying in the process, they would assume he took power. He nationalized all the industries, and he wanted to create a homogeneous, I'd say synergetic and unified way of understanding the entire nationalized economy. So he hired Stafford to do this. And I wanted to actually have Stafford himself, in a video that I found, actually describe how it kind of happened.
Monitoring the homeostat that connects 3 and 4. That's how it was. Now, the story that I want to tell you began in 1971, in the middle of the year. I had been going around using this model that I have explained to you in big companies, in agencies, in all sorts of places. And then I suddenly got a letter which very much changed my life. It was from the technical general manager of the State Planning Board of Chile. Remember, 1971, President Allende was in office. He remarked in this letter that he had studied all my works, he had collected a team of scientists together, and would I please come and take it over? I could hardly believe it, as you can imagine. But this was to start me on a journey which made me travel 8,000 miles over and over and over again. I was commuting between London and Santiago for 2 years. While that model of the viable system's in your mind, let me tell you what happened when I first explained it to President Allende himself. Allende was a doctor, a medical doctor, as you may know. And therefore, it was very easy to explain the model to him in terms of neurocybernetics as the way of controlling the body. And then I went into the business of controlling the state. And so I said to him, let us suppose that these elements of the state are the big departments of state, like the foreign affairs and the economy and home affairs, so on. And then we'll have those, and the following things will happen, and then we must have a system 2, and I built it up on a piece of paper lying on the table between us. Then a system 3 and a system 4, and I got that far. And then I got to system 5, and I drew a big histrionic breath. And I said, I was going to say, this, compañero presidente, is you. Before I could say it, he suddenly smiled very broadly, and he said, ah, System 5, at last, the people. That was a pretty powerful thing to happen. It had a very big influence on me. I can't go into that aspect, the political aspect, in this program. It's not what it's about. But I'm sure you'll bear in mind that I don't have to go and work in places where I don't want to be. That we mobilized, and now we can look at a schematic of it. Here we have it, the whole 3,000 miles, all coming to a telephone switchboard on a daily basis, all this information, going here to the cybernetic network center, which can handle these data using, of course, a computer. Now, I have been very much blamed for doing this, and I resent the blame I've had very much. I've been told that I centralized power for Dr. Allende. This isn't the case at all, as I'm going to try and show you in a minute. These data were not used in an autocratic fashion at all. They all went to one computer because we only had one computer. And if you've only got one computer, then ipso facto, you're centralized. But we were not centralized in the political sense in which this has been taken up by some critics.
An excellent video that you can find online, and he goes through much more detail in terms of how he approached it. I want to note that the Soviet Union, while there were certain variants that happened, they had a hideously bureaucratic system, naturally hierarchical. And this is in complete contrast. This was system overlap. Obviously, you have a certain level of overlap when it comes to how you control and start to manage, but it's very, very different in terms of the viable system model that actually took a democratic account, but also preserving the integrity of the system as a priority. So Stafford Beer and Allende disliked greatly the Soviet Union's work, and this project was very, very different. It's really sad because it's a footnote of history. Cybersyn never made it out of the preparatory stages when the CIA-backed coup occurred. And I love this shot. It says, U.S. is keeping hands off. And of course, it was declassified later that the U.S. was very much part of it, as they were with many overthrows in Latin and South America. And they destroyed the control room that we saw, that unique space-looking thing that was actually kind of tongue-in-cheek when they designed it. And the managers were in prison. Stafford Beer had to flee. And of course, the new government went back to capitalism and so on. So while it was a primitive experiment, if you will, and certainly not with the intent of what we call a resource-based economy exactly in terms of what they were doing in the framework, Project Cybersyn has so much great information that we can learn from in terms of actual social management, especially economic management, that I really want to plant that seed. Like, imagine if we had the advanced technology we have now with real-time information, and we apply the same type of system. It'd be stunning what could be done. So if it wasn't for the force of capitalist hegemony, which was clearly behind the overthrow once again, the world might have actually witnessed a new economic model. So anyway, new model of industrial economic organization, inspiring a revolution of design, science, and economic democracy on a global scale. That's what could have happened here if we actually let it come to fruition. So I'm going to end there. I hope that was informative. And now we can have questions. Or actually, I take that back. Now we have some other speakers that are going to come up. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.